For over a century, the iconic rhythm of trains came from tiny gaps, simple breaks in steel that kept disaster at bay. Today, those gaps have vanished. The tracks stretch for miles, silent and seamless. But without those gaps, every rail holds back a force powerful enough to twist steel and derail everything. How did engineers turn a potential catastrophe into quiet progress? And what hidden dangers does this new technique invite? To understand, we have to return to the age of the clickety-clack. A train once announced itself long before it arrived. The sound was unmistakable, wheels striking steel, a steady rhythm echoing across fields and city blocks. Each note came from a gap, a deliberate break between short lengths of rail. Passengers felt the pulse through wooden seats and iron frames, counting the beats as the countryside slipped past. For engineers, those gaps were both a necessity and a nuisance. They allowed rails to stretch and shrink with the seasons. But every joint was a weak spot, a place where metal hammered metal and bolts rattled loose. The clickety-clack became the heartbeat of travel, woven into memories and songs, but it masked a constant battle. Crews spent endless hours tightening bolts and replacing worn plates, chasing problems that multiplied with every passing train. A mile of track could contain hundreds of joints, each one a tiny compromise between safety and practicality. The gaps themselves were small, sometimes no wider than a finger, but over the course of a journey their impact grew. Wheels would thump and vibrate, sending shivers through carriages and shaking loose the very bolts meant to hold the rails together. The nostalgia for that old rhythm lingers. But beneath the charm lay a world of noise, wear, and ceaseless repair. The sound that once defined the railroad age was, in truth, the echo of a problem waiting for a solution. Crews walked the lines day and night, tightening bolts by hand, sometimes in freezing rain or blistering heat. Each joint demanded attention, hundreds of them in a single mile. A single loose bolt could rattle itself apart in hours, threatening the safety of every train that passed. Track inspectors carried heavy bags of wrenches and spare parts, always chasing the next problem before it turned into a derailment. A retired mechanic from a heritage railway summed it up. Jointed track used to sound like a metronome. Click, click, click. Passengers thought it was charming. Engineers knew it was friction, wear, and future repairs. The constant pounding at every gap meant more than just noise. It forced trains to slow down, especially on older lines where maintenance lagged behind. Speed limits protected passengers from the worst jolts, but they also stretched schedules and cut into profits. Freight loads bounced and shifted, wearing out carriages and shaking loose cargo. Passengers, too, felt every bump. The jolts traveled up through the wheels, into the seats, and sometimes sent cups flying in the dining car. The cost of keeping jointed tracks safe was staggering. Maintenance teams patrolled the rails, sometimes weekly, searching for cracked plates and missing bolts. Even with constant vigilance, failures slipped through. A single broken joint could derail a train, so the work never truly stopped. The old rhythm of the rails, so often remembered with fondness, was in reality a warning, a signal that the system was reaching its limits. The need for a better solution grew with every passing mile. At the edge of a construction site, two rail ends hang in the air, separated by a gap just wide enough for a gloved finger. The welding foreman checks the alignment one last time, eyes narrowed against the glare of floodlights. Every fraction of a millimeter matters. If the rails aren't perfectly straight, the joint will never hold. Workers clamp heavy molds around the gap, packing them tight with sand and clay to keep the molten metal contained. Propane torches roar to life, heating the steel to a deep, glowing red. The heat is not just for show. Preheating drives out moisture and slows the cooling, so the new weld will not crack or turn brittle when the temperature drops. Above the gap, a crucible filled with a gray, grainy powder waits. The mix is simple: iron oxide and aluminum, measured by hand, sometimes with a few alloy pellets added to match the steel's chemistry. The foreman nods, and a spark triggers the reaction. In seconds, the powder erupts in a white-hot flare, climbing past 2,500 degrees Celsius, hot enough to melt iron, hot enough to turn the night into day. The molten steel pours down, heavier than the floating slag, and fills the gap between the rails. Timing is everything. "You get one shot," the foreman says. "Pour too soon, you get a weak joint. Wait too long and the slag hardens inside." As the weld cools, the metal shrinks, drawing the rails together into a single, seamless line. Workers break away the molds, chip off the cooled slag, and grind the new joint until it is smooth as the original rail. In less than an hour, a gap that once echoed with every passing train has vanished, replaced by a bond that is nearly invisible but built to last. A welded rail is more than a line of metal fused together. Deep inside each joint, the story of its strength unfolds in layers, a tale told in steel. Metallurgists study these welds under powerful microscopes, tracing the boundary between the original rail and the molten metal poured during the thermite reaction. At the very center lies the fusion zone, a region of coarse perlite formed as the molten steel cools and hardens. This area is tough, yet just soft enough to flex under a passing train. Surrounding it is the heat-affected zone, where the high temperatures from welding have changed the crystal structure of the steel. The grains here grow larger or smaller depending on how quickly the rail cools, and that difference matters. Rapid cooling can make the steel hard but brittle, while a slower, controlled drop in temperature produces a resilient, ductile material. A rail metallurgist explains that sensors watch the cooling rate, lasers check the alignment, and the welder's instinct is irreplaceable. The right touch during cooling can mean the difference between a weld that lasts decades and one that cracks in a single winter. Every weld is tested before it is cleared for trains. Samples are cut, bent, and hammered in the lab. Hardness is measured on the Rockwell C scale, aiming for a range between 26 and 30, hard enough to resist wear but not so brittle that a cold snap can break it. Bend tests force the steel to flex, proving the weld can survive the repeated pounding of heavy freight. Only those joints that pass every check are allowed to remain, ensuring that each seamless rail is built to endure both the weight of the locomotive and the relentless push and pull of the seasons. Steel rails stretch and shrink with every swing of the weather, but on a modern railroad, there's no room for movement you can see. Instead, the rail is locked in place by heavy sleepers and tons of packed stone. Any urge to lengthen or shorten gets trapped as invisible force, compression in the summer and tension in the winter. This is the physics of stress and strain, where a rail tries to change length, but the track bed clamps down, turning that motion into internal pressure. The temperature at which the rail is installed, known as the neutral temperature, becomes the baseline. Above it, the steel wants to expand and pushes against itself. Below it, the metal pulls tight. A maintenance manager might explain it like this: we don't let the rail move, we let it push and pull against itself, and we keep watch on those forces year-round. Heat does not ask permission. On the hottest days, steel rails can reach temperatures far above the air, building invisible force inside every kilometer of track. When that pressure overwhelms the grip of the ballast and sleepers, the rail can buckle sideways in a sudden, violent twist, a failure railroaders call a sun kink. These kinks can form in seconds, triggered by a passing train or a weak spot in the foundation. In severe cases, the rail bends sharply enough to derail a locomotive. Cold brings its own threat. When winter pulls the steel tight, cracks can appear without warning, splitting the rail with a sharp metallic pop. Both dangers demand constant attention. Modern networks rely on sensors that track temperature and stress, sending alerts when conditions approach danger. Crews patrol high-risk sections, tamping ballast and checking anchors. A maintenance manager puts it plainly: if the rail moves when it shouldn't, we get an alarm. Then it's boots on the ground fast. Every mile of seamless rail carries invisible, pent-up force contained only by careful design and constant vigilance. As climate extremes intensify, the margin for error shrinks. Our world depends on systems that quietly defy failure, until the day they do not. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this look at hidden engineering, please subscribe for more. What do you think? Drop your thoughts below.